Good morning, everyone. I'm here to present my research proposal on the topic vocabulary retention in Sri Lankan secondary level students, a comparative study of memorization and contextual application methods. Here I'll be focusing on the students who are following the national curriculum of Sri Lanka. To begin with, here's a quick outline of my presentation, starting off with introduction, background, problem statement, purpose of the study, literature review, research questions, objectives, methodology, limitations and ethical considerations, significance of the study, the thesis structure, timeline of the research, followed by the references. So let's start off with an introduction. So in our increasingly globalized and business-driven world, English proficiency is critical for success. English serves as a lingua franca, marking high communication skills and often social status. For Sri Lankan students, mastering vocabulary is essential as English is a core subject integral to academic and career success. English language has been made the priority in the national curriculum framework of Sri Lankan education system from the earliest stages, beginning in the kindergarten and continuing through secondary and tertiary education. Despite Sri Lanka has invested a significant period of time spanning from 13 to 15 years for most students, there still remains a concern whether this education system adequately prepares learners with the level of proficiency required to meet the evolving impositions of trade, professional communications, and social interactions. However, our exam-oriented system emphasizes memorization, which prioritizes test scores over genuine language competence. Therefore, the study aims to compare two strategies, memorization and contextual application, to determine which better supports the vocabulary retention. Ultimately, effective vocabulary retention is crucial for both academic and achievements and career advancements. Moving on to the background of my study. In Sri Lankan schools, vocabulary learning relies heavily on rote memorization. This approach limits long-term retention and meaningful language use. Factors such as infrequent reading and writing, frequent code switching, and a lack of interactive methods make recalling vocabulary difficult. Additionally, some words introduced in the curriculum do not resonate with the students' cultural experiences. In contrast, contextual learning strategies engages students with vocabulary in real-life situations, enhancing understanding and retention. Notably, research specifically focused on vocabulary strategies of Sri Lankan secondary students is lacking. This study addresses the need for more effective methods at a crucial stage, potentially benefiting students' future academic and professional prospects. Next, let's move on to the problem statement. To begin with, according to AFA Halik, vocabulary is a key to effective communication, whether oral or written. However, the current emphasis on rote learning in Sri Lanka's exam-focused system fails to promote lasting vocabulary knowledge. Moreover, there are limited opportunities for students to use vocabulary in real-world context. As a result, vocabulary retention suffers, impacting students' overall language competence and their ability to use English practically outside of school. Next, let's move on to the purpose of the study. So the study aims to evaluate effectiveness of contextual application versus memorization for vocabulary retention among Sri Lankan secondary students, specifically focusing on the national curriculum. Research suggests that learning vocabulary in isolation, as memorization often entails, is one of the weakest forms of language acquisition. By comparing these methods, the research seeks to address prevalent educational challenges in Sri Lanka. The goal is to identify strategies that enhance learning outcomes and support national curriculum improvements. So next, let's move on to the literature review. Here, I'll be emphasizing on the importance of vocabulary retention and the limitations of rote memorization for vocabulary retention and the advantages of contextual application methods for vocabulary retention. So, research shows that vocabulary is essential for language mastery, as emphasized by Alena Zurova, 2020. And also, he states that contextual learning has a significant impact. According to Zarfsaz and Yekenfo, 2021, it highlights that ample contextual cues make learners more comfortable and motivated. According to Fengyu, 2003, he adds that understanding world nuances through varied context deepens knowledge. And Asghari Mustafa, 2012, found that contextual exposure strengthens long-term retention. In contrast, U 2011 notes that rote memorization provides only short-term benefits. Craig and Lockhart depth of processing model in 1972 further supports that deep engagement enhances retention, something rote memorization often fails to achieve. So next, let's move on to the research questions. So my research addresses the following questions, which are what are the impacts of memorization versus contextual application on vocabulary retention among Sri Lankan secondary students? And secondly, how do these methods influence students' ability to use and recall vocabulary in practical context? Thirdly, why do students in Sri Lanka rely heavily on memorization for vocabulary learning? And finally, what teaching strategies could be recommended for vocabulary retention? So moving on to the main objectives. So the primary objective is to determine which method memorization or contextual application results better vocabulary retention. So specifically, I aim to measure the measure the retention rates using memorization and assess retention rates with contextual application. Thirdly, analyze the effectiveness of both methods in real-world language use. And finally, identify potential improvements for vocabulary instructions in Sri Lanka. Next, let's move on to the methodology. So I will use a mixed method approach, which includes both qualitative and quantitative methods. So for quantitative data, a questionnaire will be distributed to 100 students, followed by pre and post tests to measure vocabulary retention for both methods. And qualitative data will come from interviews with 10 students and 2 teachers, providing insights into their experience with each approach. So moving on to the limitations and ethical considerations, there are some limitations such as time constraints for comprehensive testing and potential variations in students' engagement. Prior knowledge and individual motivation may also affect the outcomes. So written consents will be obtained from all the participants, including students and teachers interviewed. And also, I will maintain anonymity and strict data confidentiality throughout the study. So moving on to the significance of the study. So this study could greatly benefit English education in Sri Lanka by evaluating effective vocabulary teaching strategies. Insights from the study may inform curriculum reforms, focusing on methods that promote practical vocabulary use. As students often lack access to language environments, understanding which strategies work best can improve their language learning experience, supporting future academic and career success. Moving on to the research structure. So the thesis structure. So the thesis will follow this structure, as you could see, starting off with the abstract, introduction, literature review, methodology, data analysis, findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Finally, the reference list. So finally, moving on to the timeline of the research. Here, as you could see, the time, here's the timeline for completing the research, which would be around 3 months. So this plan will ensure systematic progress and timely completion of the study. And with that comes to an end of my presentation. Thank you so much.